How's the sound? Can you hear me? Pretty good? Okay, great. So welcome everyone to And Also, Artists and Designers Writing. This is a symposium exploring a unique form of dual practice, that of the artist or designer who also writes. I'm Jennifer Liese, and I'm the director of the RISD Writing Center. Patty Phillips, Dean of Graduate Studies, who you met at the door with the program, and I are co-teaching a graduate course right now in which the students are both the editors of and the writers for a graduate student publication. So today's symposium will give all of them a view into how this kind of editing and writing happens out in the world outside of RISD. And I'm sure that what we learn today will inform our publication, which I hope you'll all keep an eye out for come about May. But why are we opening up this conversation to all of you outside of the context of the course? Why are artists and designers' writings important to all of us here today? It may be because you are an artist or designer who also writes, or you want to write more. It may be because you love to read artists and designers' writings, which have a long and storied lineage, from early 20th century manifestos to the criticism and experimental writings of, say, Donald Judd and Robert Smithson in the 60s and 70s, to Ai Weiwei's blog posts today, in which he talks about art and architecture and politics and activism. We're interested, too, because today artists and designers' writings are wildly proliferating, appearing in public forums ranging from Creative Time reports to Triple Canopy to Design Observer to The New Inquiry to Paper Monument to PRAXIS, all of them boldly featuring artists and designers' writings like never before. And then, of course, there are artists who are self-publishing. If any of you were at the recent New York Art Book Fair, you know what I'm talking about. It's booming. We're compelled because we know that technology and the internet have changed and are continuing to change writing in ways we don't yet fully understand. What we do know is that the alphabetic, linguistic foundations of writing are increasingly complemented by oral, kinetic, hyperlinked, interactive, and most of all, visual modes of expression. And in this newly expanded, multi-sensory writing ecology, we might just wonder whether artists and designers have special rhetorical powers, or whether writing is even an expansive enough term for what we're talking about. With the future of print and writing itself up in the air, not to mention an increasing distrust of master narratives, we know that we have something to learn from artists and designers' writings, which, like art and design themselves, so often tread fearlessly into the unknown and speak truth to power. But I think I'm getting ahead of ourselves. I'm going to review our afternoon, and we'll see many of these ideas and issues unfold throughout the day. So as you'll see in your program, and if you didn't get one on your way in, there's more in the back, and feel free to grab one. We have two sets of presentations. Each are followed by a Q&A, and then a collective conversation with all of our 6 presenters. And then we'll have a little bit more conversation out in the lobby from 5 to 6 with wine and cheese to sustain us. On the first panel, we have 3 editors of artists and designers' writings, and on the second, we have 3 artists and designers who themselves are writers. And all of them will be sharing their own work, and then in the conversation we hope that that will spin off into some of our shared interests and questions. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to the RISD Museum. Thank you, Sarah, for so kindly co-sponsoring this event. And I'm so pleased to introduce our first speaker. Amanda Reeser Lawrence is a practicing architect, and she teaches at Northeastern University, and she's the co-founding editor, or the founding co-editor, of PRAXIS, a journal of writing and building. And in all cases, we'll keep our introductions of our speakers brief, but you have longer biographies in your programs. So please help me welcome Amanda. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Patty, for inviting me to be here today. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to speak about PRAXIS, which is an architectural journal the byline is actually a journal of writing plus building, but I've never actually had a chance to think through the writing part in this kind of venue, and I'm so grateful for that, and to be with a really esteemed group of colleagues and a really diverse mix. I usually speak to audiences of architects or architecture students, and PRAXIS is a journal that features architecture, but we also, from the beginning, have, and in a way that I don't think I ever was able even to articulate to myself, always had the writing piece was an important aspect of it. So what I'd like to take an opportunity to do this afternoon is show you some examples from the journal, talk a little bit about the founding of the journal, and hopefully start to suggest some questions about this role of designers writing and how I approach editing also of designers writing. So like I said, PRAXIS is a journal. It's a 128-page non-commercial journal of architecture of the Americas that I co-founded in 1998. That is really a long time ago now, with a woman named Ashley Schaefer. We were students at Columbia University finishing the Masters of Architecture program, and really naively sort of said, you know, there aren't really any good magazines. Maybe we should just start our own. And so we did. I'm happy to talk more about that process maybe in the Q&A. But I wanted to actually start with a quote that was really important to us as we began this process, and which now in the context of today's symposium I think takes on an importance as well. And this was a quote from an Italian architect named Vittorio Grigotti. And Grigotti was a well-known architect and also editor of a magazine called Casabella, an important architecture magazine. And he had this quote that really spoke to us as architects who were embarking on this process of editing. And he talks about the fact that editing a magazine, he puts editing a magazine as a part of a kind of larger research and design practice, right? So like teaching or participating in public debates is a way of cultivating theoretical reflection, not as a separate activity, but as an indispensable part of design craft. And I think that is an important quote. And for us, that always meant that this is a kind of holistic, that we didn't see editing as something separate from what we did as architects. I should say also that I'm actually a licensed architect, but I'm not a practicing architect. I have a PhD and I teach architectural history and theory courses. But for the idea that it wasn't something that you did outside of your work as an architect, but the same kind of process of inquiry as a designer that you brought to a design problem, that was the same way we were thinking about editing a journal. And that was really powerful for us. And I think that's powerful in the context of today's conversation, too. We've produced 15 journals. I hesitate to even call PRAXIS a journal because it takes us a long time to make one. And I can tell you we have lots of angry subscribers writing, where is my issue? But I think serial publication is probably a better term. But that's our first issue from 1999 when we were just coming out of Columbia. That's actually an image of the Bernard Tschumy's Lerner Center, which was just being completed at Columbia at the time. And then our most recent issue from a couple years ago where we looked at actually the way that architects tell stories. There's a little hiatus because we also produced the, we were part of the team at the Venice Biennale last year, and we produced the agenda, the catalog that came out of the Biennale. But so this issue, I think, shows, so each issue is thematically organized. And within the context of the issue, we feature architects' writings and architects' buildings. And that, the writing piece, these are some early logos as we were trying to conceptualize the journal. I kind of like the fuzzy pixelated quality now that the slide has gotten so old. But the name PRAXIS was important to us, and I haven't thought about this in so long, but the runner-up, so PRAXIS, we were unaware of the Marxist connotations. This is back to the naivete thing. But for us, PRAXIS was just an important word because it suggested the translation of theory into practice. And that's what we were excited about with architecture. We wanted to look at projects that we felt like were translating theoretical concepts into actual built artifacts. But the runner-up was epigraph. An epigraph is, you know, words that are written on buildings. And since we were a journal of writing plus building, the plus now feels very late 90s. But the writing plus building, the epigraph in the end seemed a little too like neocon sounding, and it was sort of on the heels of postmodernism, so we didn't want anyone to think that we were a post. So we went with PRAXIS. But it was always, for us, PRAXIS was a way, and this, again, in the context of today's conversation, I think is important, where we situated ourselves very deliberately between what were then the two dominant modes of architectural publications, one of which were really heavy theory, densely textual, very mildly illustrated journals like Assemblage. Assemblage was edited by K. Michael Hayes, who actually later became my doctoral advisor, which is kind of funny. But so we were reacting against that model, which there's a lot of Deleuze, Foucault, Derrida, images of buildings every once in a while, versus architecture or architectural record or any number of trade publications which were, splashy sunset images of buildings, a lot of advertisements. And this is, of course, the landscape has changed now, and we were sort of just on, online publications were just starting to emerge. That's a whole other conversation, but I think we really wanted to incorporate both of those aspects, right? And I should also say that there was models like progressive architecture had just recently folded when we started, but we were really drawn journals more like that, or even a lot of European models like an El Croquis, or we felt like there was a way to create, there was a type of architecture publication that didn't exist in America, which was both text and image heavy, and more importantly, which featured art projects in depth. We were also really inspired, I should say, by the kind of what Denise Scott Brown talked about, the kind of little magazines, or later when Peter Eisman was talking about Perspecta, he called the big little magazines, this idea of a magazine that's kind of, grassroots, comes up from kind of often from the margins, is a little more polemical, is not institutionally affiliated. And over the years, we actually had a lot of offers to become affiliated with institutions, and we really didn't do that because we really valued the independence. I should say PRAXIS is totally independently published and funded, and it's really a bootstrap operation. This was a little template that I found from the early days, too, that I think is interesting just in terms of this notion of editing, writing, designing is all of the same ilk, or at least for us, we approach it like we approach the design of the magazine in the same way that we approached design problems in the architecture studio. And so we actually generated this early diagram for how to conceptualize the journal. What would be the kind of main body of it? How would we, by the way, this actually ended up not translating at all into the journal. Nevertheless, the idea that this was the only way we knew how to approach it, right? This was how we were thinking about a journal as a design artifact. And to get more to the topic of writing, I think I was looking through and thinking about these 15 issues, and from the beginning, something that was very important to us was to feature architectural projects and also architects writing about those buildings, and then critics kind of as a triad, those three things. So architects' writings, critics' writings, and then the projects themselves. As part of that, we were very interested in questions rather than declarations, and we actually began the journal with a series of, this is the first editorial, and we very deliberately set up a series of 5 questions, sort of with a nod to Le Corbusier's 5 points. So we had 5 questions. We weren't making arguments or points, or even, it wasn't a kind of manifesto sensibility. It was really an inquiry sensibility. And then over the years in the journal, we've actually included, I never noticed this until I was preparing for today, that we ask a lot of questions, and actually the form of the interview became a default for us, partly because architects tell you they don't have any time to write something. So it's an easy way to get a kind of argument out of an architect. But I think it fits with the way our approach is that we like this idea of a kind of question-based. So this is an article that we had early on in that same first issue where Bernard Tschumi, we interviewed him about this project and about his practice in general. We also, this was a little bit later, where we went back and we interviewed Rem Koolhaas and Bernard Tschumi about, this is an issue on program, and we saw both of them as important figures in the kind of rethinking of program, particularly in the 70s and 80s, and so we asked them both the same question and then featured their answers side by side along with the timeline of their projects that were relevant to those questions. We also try, whenever we can, the pairing of architectural work and architects' writings, I think, is an important pairing. And in this case, this is an example from an issue we did on technology where we had an architect named Mark Goldthorpe. He has a firm called Decoy, and we were featuring his work at this, and very deliberately trying to pair that literally on the same page, thinking about what images, what projects are kind of aligning with the statements and comments that he's making in this interview. So that juxtaposition has always been really important, and maybe we can talk more about how one thinks about that relationship between those two, literally in the space of a layout. This is just more of that same interview in his work. In that same issue, we also featured Sheila Kennedy's work, who's an architect at MIT, and who also Here there's an interview. One thing I just think it's worth saying, and maybe we can talk about later, is the question of, often we encounter this notion that architects can't write, right? And I was thinking about this as I was thinking about the interview. I was like, did we do interviews because architects can't write? And I don't think that's true, but I think it's something worth thinking about. So many of the architects that we admired, people like Bernard Tschumi, people like Early Koolhaus, people like Eisenman or Greg Lynn, like all those architects were it was their written projects that we admired as much as their architecture itself. And so I think that's something that was really important to us, to allow the space for architects to articulate their ideas in words as well as in designs. But I'll just throw that out there. I think as a bias that still exists in architecture, or a presumption that architects, because they're skilled in one aspect, which is they're skilled as designers, they maybe are not skilled as writers. I think we have not found that to be true. We also have done a lot of work with, as an interesting exploration for us, in responsive texts, where we have, in this case, we had a series of architectural critics responding to Hal Foster had just produced a text called Designing Crime, and there was a kind of a lot of buzz about it. So we had different critics talk about his text. Hal Foster is pissed at us to this day, by the way, because he really did not like what these people had to say about his text. We also had to give him space to respond. It would be much easier if it was a blog, but this was pre-blog. So, then you have to print the response, and since we only come out every 2 years, that's kind of a challenge. But nevertheless, I think this idea of multiple voices is also a really important part for us, I think, of what writing in architecture means, allowing different vantage points on a given issue. Sorry. This is a questionnaire we did for different curators. We did an issue on curation, and we had different architecture curators talking about how they conceptualize curation. I just thought I would put one more issue. How funny. Anyway, I guess that's wanted to go all together. Maybe if I go backwards. We did an issue a few years ago that became very self-conscious that we've become much more text-heavy, actually, as we've gotten more mature, and this was an issue that we had 11 architects interview each other. So we did a kind of round robin where we were always present and asking questions too, but this notion that they would ask questions of one another. So here we had, and the design of the journal was actually split so that you would have these parallel interviews running. So you'd have the living interviewing Hal or Yoon, and then the next one, Hal or Yoon would interview someone else, and then they would kind of run, kind of tracking across each other horizontally on the page. These are some of those examples of those interviews. And I think this was also a powerful way to think about how architects express their ideas in writing. I did want to so one of the things that was sort of suggested in the questions, and I just wanted to touch on, I don't have a clock up here, so I have no idea how much time I've taken, but I want to touch on two more issues. The first one is why print, and I think this is an interesting question. Today it was a question that we were asked somewhat when we first started in 1999. There certainly were starting to be online publications, nowhere near the depth or breadth that we have today, but I think it's still a valid question. What is the role of the artifact itself? And that's something that's always been incredibly important to us, and I think it's also because we conceptualize it as a design project. This is my office at home, and I put this up just to also talk about the challenges of, PRAXIS is slow, but it's also heavy, and it's like, it's carting it around is a pain, and it's really expensive to ship the issues. I mean, we don't even make any money by the time we send it to someone in Europe. It's like, I think we lose money actually for what we cost. So, but this idea of the thingness of PRAXIS has its drawbacks, but it also, I think for us, that is really the joy and the love of the artifact. And this is where I think as designers editing, right, that's our joy in making these issues often emerges. And I'll just take you through a few examples of how we approach the art design of the artifact itself. So we work with someone named Ronald Rael. I don't know what's happening with this slideshow, but it has a mind of its own. So there's all the slides. It's funny, it'll go backwards one by one, but when it goes forwards, it progresses. Anyway, we have designed a series of covers over the years that, for us, the covers themselves have to articulate the thematic in a way that we feel like the projects that we're including are doing as well. So in other words, it's not just an image of a project inside, but how do we conceptualize the design of the magazine in the same way that these architects are conceptualizing the theme. So this is an example where we're looking at surface, the question of surface, and we did an in-depth study of Herzog and de Meuron's new de Young Museum out in San Francisco, which you may know that facade. It has a kind of metal dimpled, perforated facade that was actually based on an image that they had found of a kind of light coming down through the trees, and they literally just pixelated the image and then created the kind of perforation pattern. So we thought, well, how could we translate that actually into the cover of the journal? So at great cost and headache, we actually made this early kind of laser cut pixelated image, so there would be a kind of semi-translucent idea that then you would have a kind of hint of the issue behind. And sorry about the cheesy filter there on PowerPoint. Similarly with the, I'll go back to, this is our issue on technology, where this was at a moment where there was, this was 2006 or so, and there was thermochromic ink, which is an ink that changes property. In this case, when it's heated, it becomes transparent, more or less. So in the same way that we were looking at architects that were reconceptualizing technologies, what would be the technology of printing that we could think through in terms of the issue itself? So we printed an image with thermochromic ink and actually hid the table of contents behind. So you can see the table of contents is behind this image. We didn't print it anywhere else in the journal. So you had to, when the idea was when you hold the journal in the heat of your hand, now it's going to go fast, just warn you, because when I go forward it does that. The heat of your hand would make this, by the way, I think this was in a sauna or something. I don't know. That was a really warm room. And the problem with thermochromic ink is it doesn't actually work after a while. So you can no longer access the table of contents to this journal because you can't get behind it. Nevertheless, that was another example, I think, of us just trying to conceptualize the cover. And a final one, I do want to show you issue 4, which is where we're looking at landscapes. And we were considering the cover itself as a kind of landscape as a thickened condition, thinking about surface layers of landscape. And so we actually used it's a technology of, like, when you get a new credit card and there's the I'm blanking on the name, it's like an electromagnetic kind of thing, but it's not sticky, but it actually, so it's a plastic-like film that was attached to the cover. We get calls all the time from people that are like, my cover broke. We're like, no, it's supposed to do that. So you peel away, the idea is that you would peel away this kind of outer layer. We featured Dillard and Scafidio's Blur building inside, and so we had a kind of abstracted version of that with words from the table of contents, so actually telescoping through. So as you peeled away, you would see these words, and then as you moved into the body of the journal, those words were actually taken from the table of contents. So I just want to end by a question of the end, and this is a kind of moment in which we're actually thinking about what does it mean to have been publishing this for 15 years? What is the landscape of architecture publications today? How do we fit? Where should we fit? And we've actually just putting out a call for a final issue. Or at least it might turn into something else. I don't know, but it feels like, PRAXIS it costs us $25,000 to print each issue, and increasingly we're finding that I think it is a moment to question what is the role. Back to this little magazine model, right? Are these magazines meant to be kind of ephemeral and occupy a kind of certain moment in time, and has that moment passed? And so I feel like I'm on the therapy couch here now, but nevertheless, I think for me, this is maybe part of this conversation about writing and building and these types of journals. How do they participate in architectural discourse, and is there a kind of suggestion of a finite time period? So I welcome thoughts about that too. But thank you. I've really enjoyed this opportunity to present some of these ideas, and I look forward to a conversation.
Thank you, Amanda. Don't go over the edge. So Brian Wallace is our next speaker, and Brian is a renowned curator and historian of photography, but he's here today to talk about Blasted Allegories, which is a book of artist writings that he edited way back in 1987, I think, but which I would say is still the Bible of contemporary artist writings today. So we're really excited to hear where it stands for you these days. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. I just want to echo Amanda's remarks about this program, which I think is really exciting. And as Jen pointed out, I think it's coming at a propitious time because there is tremendous interest in not just artists, but architects. Everybody has access to a platform to write and publish now, not just online, but all of the small publications, artist books. Anybody can do it cheaply and easily now. And as Jen was mentioning, if you go to the Artist Book Fair at PS1 every year, it's just thousands of artists, small publishers, and so there's this incredible proliferation of activity now in this intersection between what used to be very separate realms of art and writing. So I'm happy to come here and talk about it. It's really one of my favorite topics. Great panels here. I started out working with artist books, so it's tremendously exciting to me to see this revival so many years later. I don't have any slides. I wish I'd had Amanda design some for me, but I'm really more on the writer side, and sometimes the pictures tend to overwhelm what's really important to me, which is that intersection and interpenetration of art ideas and visual images. But really what I'm here for is to dust off Blasted Allegories, a 25-year-old volume that set out a long time ago to document what was at that point a real intense intersection of art making and critical writing in the early 1980s. It was really a genuine movement at the time. It was very clear to discern the boundaries and the issues that were involved. So I think it was sort of easier than it might appear to have compiled this reader because these people knew one another and so on. So what I want to do, just very briefly, is sketch out some of the history and animating principles behind this book, and to briefly suggest some of the ways that I think the ideas and the impetus behind the book remain relevant today, or are newly relevant today, maybe. And certainly, I look forward to having conversation about the general ideas or the specifics of how something like this comes about. So it so happens I was a very young guy, and Blasted Allegories was published in 1988 as the second critical anthology of writings produced by the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. I was commissioned by New Museum director and founder Marcia Tucker to compile an anthology of artist statements. And at that time, what that meant was those writings that artists would do, a little paragraph or something that would be published in a catalog. And I think Marcia Tucker's idea was like a little paragraph statement juxtaposed with a picture of like the real art. It is interesting, like why we think that artists don't write or writers don't make art, or why there isn't more intermedia association and collaboration. And in fact there is, but particularly at that time in the 1980s, there was very much a formal routine where you had to separate those practices, and the artist's writings or statements were very much regarded as a supplement to the art, which was the real thing. So I had a different idea. I sought to engage what I saw around me as a very lively intersection of textual writing, criticism, and image making that really was thoroughly interdependent. Not only were the people all associating with one another, reading the same things, seeing the same things, talking about the same things, but the products that they produced were actually intermingled. So you'd have montage text overlaid on images, or you'd have publications that had a wild array of images and writings and so forth by, again, a wide range of people from, filmmakers, dancers, artists, photographers, critics, theorists, all those things, in an incredibly diverse range of publications. Small magazines, like PRAXIS, and at that time many others, that were published in the same way, like on a shoestring, with grants from the NEA at that point, artist books, artworks themselves, and sometimes interventions in larger publications. I myself published a small magazine called Wedge, and other artists and critics did the same. Writers such as Kathy Acker and Lynn Tillman were collaborating with visual artists. Artists such as Ann Turin and Richard Prince were compiling their own collections of literary writings. So there was a lot going on at the time, and there was no mistaking the fact that this was really a movement and a practice that was changing what were previously discrete forms. As I said, there were numerous texts that incorporated images and artworks that incorporated words. And here you might think of, for example, Barbara Kruger, that kind of thing, but many, many others doing that kind of thing. And it seemed to me at that time that virtually every artist I knew was also a writer, and most of the writers were also producing some form of art making. Or at least they were all going to the same openings. Blasted Allegories forthrightly focused on New York artists and writers. That was the audience I knew, and I didn't see a problem in restricting it that way. And the downtown writers and artists, or as they were known then, postmodernists, were pretty easy to identify. And the authors included in this book, I think there are about 40 authors, but among them Laurie Anderson, Jenny Holzer, Gary Indiana, Eric Bogosian, John Baldessari, Barbara Kruger, Bruce Nauman, Richard Prince, Spalding Gray, David Wojnarowicz, Carrie Mae Williams, and Sherry Levine. You get the idea. All big names now, but not so then. The book was designed by Bethany Johns, now a big name here at RISD, and the images were selected and designed by Barbara Bloom and Gilles Perez. The stated intention of these contributors was to deconstruct the methodologies of then entrenched modernism, part of which was the separation into discrete artistic practices and fields. But it was not only the aesthetic predilections, but also the politics and ideology of modernism that was under attack by all these artists, sometimes in ways that is not evident. This was, after all, the 1980s. Ronald Reagan was president. There was an illegal war being waged in Central America. AIDS was decimating the cultural community, and the internet hadn't even been invented yet. It was a bleak time, and I think these artists and writers, in their own modest ways, were trying to address and change the unbearable everyday conditions that surrounded them. So in addition to abolishing the distinction between fiction writers and artists, Blasted Allegories also highlighted a variety of writerly forms and approaches, some of which were quite novel and unexpected. but all united by ideas that circulated regardless of profession or stylistic approach. As I stated in the introduction to the book, for the writers in this book, these critical forms such as interviews, monologues, jokes, dream narratives, parables, etc., oppose the imposed narrative structure, the unquestioned hierarchy of characters, and the easy closure of much conventional modernist literature. In place of traditional expository writing or even experimental texts, the works collected in Blasted Allegories posit a wholly different approach to textual production, which challenges accepted sites, structures, and meanings of discourse. Doesn't it sound so 80s? In place of aesthetic innovation, these writers employ appropriation and reinscription of existing voices, styles, and genres. In place of the coherence of the conventional text, they favor a form which is fragmentary, inconclusive, digressive, and interpenetrated with other texts. In place of the omnipresent author, they acknowledge a collectivity of voices and active participation of the reader. In place of the new or the original, they accept an understanding of language and stories as already written and shaped by social and political conditions. So perhaps a bit overstated, but you get the idea. Focus less on formalistic, stylistic, or literary issues than on the theoretical and critical systems of thought underlying them and shaping social behaviors and representations. This postmodern generation of artists use texts and images to raise issues having to do with authorship and subjectivity, appropriation and property, identity and race, gender and community, institutional critique and the archive, and media and public space. The use of appropriation and montage, for example, allowed contemporary artists to create fictionalized narratives that pose fundamental questions about the representations of the self in society and in history, about the shaping effects of social stereotypes in the mass media, and about the relationship between images and truth or authenticity. And while appropriation, for example, endorsed the radical decontextualization of images from their original sites, on the other hand, it opened a space to establish new meanings and to challenge viewers to reconstruct the terms of its original use. My thesis was that all these critical writings were inherently political, challenging not only specific ideas and policies, but also conventionalized ways of thinking and shaping social ideas. The art and writing could take many forms, but what united them were the critical ideas, shaped in part by newly available European theories about representation and cultural production, by Roland Barthes, Jean-François Lyotard, Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, and Jacques Derrida. In my case, I was influenced by the American critic Craig Owens, who argued that these texts enacted their political critiques allegorically, hence the title, Blasted Allegories. In other words, whatever the nominal subject matter, whether personal or public, a larger meaning could be derived from or read through the text. Allegory is simply the rhetorical device that ascribes hidden meanings to symbolic figures in a text or image. While for many authors in the early 1980s this was deliberate, intentionality was not necessary for the function of allegory in these written pieces. The 21st century realities of new technologies and globalization have radically transformed the applications of writing and imagery, the ways they're produced and circulated and appropriated and transformed. The internet has obviously created an extraordinary space of exchange and interaction, but it has also empowered the design, ordering, and transformation of images in bold new ways. Access and simultaneity have dramatically reshaped and reconstituted the social and political landscape. a new generation of artists, writers, that includes, just to name a few, Walid Rhode, Ai Weiwei, Emily Jassir, Hito Sterl, Thomas Hirschhorn, Robbie Murray, Moira Davey, employ mimicry and gesture, narrative and history, fiction and documentary, and repetition and difference to visualize individual and collective expression, as well as convulsive social transformations. In a global context, they engage very different issues: reconsideration of information, ordering, and the archive, new issues of the politics of exile, displacement, and hybridity. They use fiction to challenge documentary fact and create a subjective reshaping of history and memory. And finally, they validate wonder, speculation, and traumatic reconstitutions of the written and the visual. These are new approaches. Some were hinted at or explored in Blasted Allegory, especially as its text examined gender, nationality, sexual identity, and racial histories, as told through the archive, the ruin, the fragment, and the trace. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So our next speaker is Marisa Mazria Katz. She is a journalist who has reported from all over the world and is here today to talk about Creative Time Reports, of which she is editor. It's a three-year-old online publication that features artists' voices from around the world on the critical issues of our times. Thanks. Let me get you set up here. Okay, Dave, we're ready.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for having me here today. How many of you know Creative Time? Show of hands. Great. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure you've seen some of our projects before, but you didn't know that they were ours. So, Tribute and Light. This incredible project was actually inaugurated 6 months after 9/11 by our former artistic director, Ann Pasternak, and has since 9/11 been shining on the city every year during the anniversary. Waiting for Godot in New Orleans. This is an amazing project that I think is really important to talk about just because it helps to sort of lay the foundation as to why Creative Time Reports exists. So, artist Paul Chan staged the play Waiting for Godot in the middle of an intersection in New Orleans, Lower 9th Ward. The idea came about after Paul visited New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina. And while he was there, he was struck by a disturbing quiet. There were no hammer sounds, there were no construction crews, and there were no cranes swinging on the skyline. His immediate response was to imagine an outdoor performance of Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. And when asked about the inspiration for the project, Chan explained, "There is a terrible symmetry between the reality of New Orleans post-Katrina and the essence of this play, which expresses in stark eloquence the cruel and funny things people do while they wait for help, for food, for tomorrow." This is another one that is an incredible project. It took place in 1989. It was Grand Fury's Kissing Doesn't Kill, Greed and Indifference Do. And this project took place during the height of the AIDS crisis in the United States. And it was a political art action that appropriated advertising and media strategies to spread information about AIDS and its social ramifications to a vast audience by pairing the piece's message with the image of 3 interracial couples, both same-sex and heterosexual, kissing. The image appeared on postcards and on the sides of buses in New York City. Now, it's kind of interesting to talk about a project like this today because, you know, we're constantly flooded with images and there are endless opportunities for us to share how we feel on social media channels constantly. But, you know, at the time, this piece was extremely powerful in its ability to get across to large audiences the urgency of the AIDS epidemic while the government was sitting by and doing nothing. And I'm not sure if a lot of you might have seen last year's 4-story high sugar sphinx from artist Kara Walker in the abandoned sugar factory. This was, you know, a project that exceeded our expectations. It was incredible to see the crowds that were coming, and it was incredible to work with an artist like Kara Walker. And I think it's really important to mention what she called the piece. You know, it was called A Subtlety, but then the full title was An Homage to the Unpaid and Overworked Artisans Who Have Refined Our Sweet Tastes from the Cane Fields to the Kitchens of the New World. It's projects like these that underscore the organization's mission that artists are important to society, that artists should be weighing in on the times in which we live, and that public spaces are places for free expression and creativity. So, roughly 5 years ago, Creative Time started to imagine other places to insert artists' voices. And there were a lot of questions that were put forth. And some of these questions were put forth actually before I even came on, because actually it's my 4-year anniversary last week. But some of these questions were, you know, if Creative Time believes that artists matter in society and if we want them to impact how we think about today's most pressing issues, what are the public spaces that would truly magnify their voices? Where should they be participating? And where is public dialogue happening? And I think the final question was really like, how can artists deepen and also bring a sense of candor back to public discourse? And, you know, it took a while, but basically we kind of came to the conclusion that the answer was online. And it took a year of incubation before Creative Time Reports was born. But in the year leading up to the launch of Creative Time Reports, we used that time when we weren't actually publishing anything to really establish several pillars on which the site would always rest. First, we would work with artists located all over the world. So this was really the exciting part of the job because, and I had already been doing so much of this as a journalist, you know, I was actually rarely home for more than 2 weeks at any given moment, but this time, this was such a different way of seeing the cities that I had traveled to. And we started by, you know, I visited Tunisia, Hungary, the United Arab Emirates, and Kenya, and this was all before we launched. Not only to meet potential contributors, but also to gauge, you know, what does it mean to have a project where artists are weighing in on the news, where artists are reporting on the world in which they live? What is that? You know, is that going to be meaningful for you? Is that going to be safe for you? And, you know, it was really interesting. Each country kind of helped me understand the things that we needed to bring to the site. So the early suspicions were that, you know, of course, a monolithic approach to the commissions were never going to work, right? That the pieces we featured had to be as wide-ranging in form, subject, and language as the contributors were diverse. So this meant for us, you know, you might go onto our site and you might see, you'll see a variety of languages, and we always privilege the artist's native language before English. And I can talk a little bit more about that, you know, maybe at the Q&A, but that was really in hopes that the pieces that we published weren't just for, you know, the American audiences, but in fact that in the respective countries that people would read it and be able to engage with it as well. It also meant cultivating a deep sensitivity to the geopolitical situations that have the potential to make our artists vulnerable. So, and this has happened in a couple of instances for us actually, that an artist has asked to remain anonymous, and we absolutely agreed to hide his or her identity. So, we also felt that one of the key components of this project was staying abreast of foreseeable potential for life-altering consequences, like the 2013 Kenya elections. And that's actually why I traveled to Kenya, was to get a sense. I knew this was going to be a very big story in 2013, and I wanted to meet people who were going to talk to me about 2007, which was the year that violence resulted in over 1,000 deaths after the last elections. And I wanted to see what were artists talking about, what was important, and what were their potential fears for the upcoming 2013 election. So this is one story that we did with an artist I met in Nairobi named Ngwatilo Mayu, and it's a piece called Kenya Elections, Whispers of Hope, Fear and Hope. And she's an incredible artist that we've actually worked with on 3 occasions. She's covered travels through the Rift Valley in Kenya, and she's also done a piece for us very recently about Somali Kenyans and their lives in Kenya at the moment. The other piece that was something that we were thinking about, long in advance, was the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan and what could potentially happen when they left. So when we look at the calendar, when we're thinking about what's going to happen, how do we want to commission? We're constantly thinking news, what's going to be in the news, how do we keep up with the news, all of these things. And I'll kind of go into that a little bit more because that can be totally terrifying when you're a team of 2. But okay. The other thing is that, in order to sort of make sure that we were relevant and part of what the news media sites were talking about, we were going to talk about evergreen issues, things that we knew for sure would be interesting to people. And that was issues like global warming, or race, surveillance, or immigration. And each time we identified these salient issues in advance, and we'd ask ourselves, who are the artists that are most poised to respond? And what we were looking for were artists that Howard Zinn described in his book, Artists in Times of War, who could think outside the boundaries of permissible thought and dare to say things that no one else will say. Finally, and this is kind of a little bit where I come in, a critical component was to try to cultivate major publication partnerships, right? So that these publications would then co-publish our pieces and thereby distribute personal perspectives and critical interventions to thousands or even millions of readers. Right, because as a team of 2, within even an organization whose primary, focus is creating public programs, how do we get our message out there? And we really felt that the way we can do it is to work with other publications. So now we're kind of like right before we launched, where we knew what we wanted to commission, and but we were still determining, exactly what these pieces would look like. And I want to just stop for 1 second and just say a little bit about me and how I think it probably affected the overall style and direction of the site. I have no art history background. I studied film, and then I moved to the Middle East. I got a master's in Middle East history, and while I was there, I started writing for publications. But the thing was, I started to I initially felt like culture was really where I felt my heart was. Like, these are the stories I wanted to tell. So I was covering the boom of museums in the Gulf, or I was speaking with artists in exile, or I was, covering, for instance, in Afghanistan, 5,000-year-old archaeological sites that were under the threat of war, and I was working in Morocco, talking about television stars and how they were communicating and working on centuries-old traditions of reconciliation to heal deep wounds within the community. So each of my stories were talking politics, but they were never really head-on. And by the time Creative Time had contacted me to start this project, I was splitting my time between New York and Morocco, where I was teaching teenagers and who lived in some of the worst slums in Morocco how to blog. So all of this is to say that, okay, I had a lot of exposure to artists, but it was really something entirely different to remove the middleman, me, and commission these pieces where we heard directly from artists around issues in the news. And, there were all these questions like that the artists were asking us, that we were asking ourselves, were our artists reporters? Should we hold them up to the same rules that we would for a journalist? What section of a newspaper would these pieces that we co-published be in, And there were several stories that helped shape the direction of the site. This is our current homepage right now. And, but I wanted to talk about one in particular that really helped me to kind of expand what this project had to be and what it could be. And this was an artist who came to us and wanted to do a very touching portrait of a country undergoing recession. And when we were editing the piece, I asked the artist for more details, about a particular passage. I think I wanted more of a description of the person that they were quoting. And they came back to me and they said, are we using a New York Times style of objectivity and fact-checking? Because actually, I'd rather not work that way. So I was like, okay, all right, that's really eye-opening, and okay, I have to embrace this, and I have this kind of news brain, but we have to widen the way that we're going to work. We have to accommodate a myriad of ways that artists are going to approach their pieces, and this sometimes meant accepting pushback when we asked for a more linear way of writing, fact-based, but it also meant that when an artist wanted to create a piece for a major publication like The Guardian, which is our main partner, we could help usher in an article that would meet the demands of the artist, first and foremost, of course, and then we could also make sure that the outlet that we were working with was really satisfied, right? That we were turning in a piece that they felt they could run. So regardless of all this, though, the project first and foremost is about privileging the voices of artists. And we had to find ways to make sure that the people who were reading our pieces were aware that who you're reading was not your typical pundits, but people who have spent years thinking and working in ways that are vastly different than any reporter. Whenever we did work with a media partner, we were always hoping to find an angle the news would be interested in, but our take would be entirely different than any of the submissions they would normally get on the subject. And you can see this in our very first partnership. This was with Foreign Policy magazine based in Washington, D.C. on the occasion of the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca undertaken by Muslims as one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And the photo essay was by an incredible Saudi artist named Ahmed Matar. And he has been working, he's had the privilege of working in Mecca with permission from the actual governor of Mecca, who has allowed him to document the rapidly transforming sacred city, which is flooded with multi-million-dollar real estate developments. So these are just a couple of the images of Ahmed's. You could see the cranes. In the center there is the Kaaba, and very vaguely you can sort of discern the people walking around it. This is a hotel room, which is fascinating. It's a hotel that was recently built that is often purchased or for year-round by companies that, so it's often empty actually, but it's a kind of an exclusive room and it overlooks the Kaaba, and so he actually snuck in and he took this image and it kind of, it sort of talks a lot about what was happening in the city. And this is an image that he took on his way home. He liked the way that the gasoline was being kind of lit up. So I just wanted to show you that this is what foreign policy did, recently in a piece where they covered the Hajj. Okay, so it's very straightforward and it's dramatic, but it kind of lacks that, it doesn't have the same sort of take on what's happening in Mecca during that time of year as Ahmed's piece. And so I think that's an important kind of distinction to show, that the kinds of pieces that we were providing to these publications. And it's really interesting to and we can talk about this during the Q&A, but the feedback from a lot of these publications where they were just eager to meet and hear of new people to report on these issues instead of going straight to the wires, right? To AP, to Getty. Like, they loved this idea that there were just the people that they had never heard of, right? And, you know, I think that that also sort of connects a little bit to a piece that kind of sort of changed Creative Time Reports, and in many ways. I mean, it was our first big piece that came out. It was with The Guardian. It was a piece by David Byrne on the effects of soaring rents in New York City, and I don't know if you've read it. I mean, one of the things about this idea of giving your pieces to publications, I mean, you really don't like often know that we actually commissioned it and worked on it and just they've given it to them. But that's okay. I mean, the point is really about inserting these artists' voices into major media. Anyway, this piece was incredible, and I just want to read a very quick passage from the piece, and that I just love, and I think really articulates what he was going after. Some folks believe that hardship breeds artistic creativity. I don't buy it. One can put up with poverty for a while when one is young, but it will inevitably wear a person down. I don't romanticize the bad old days. I find the drop in crime over the last couple of decades refreshing. I have no illusions that there was a connection between that city on its knees and a flourishing of creativity. I don't believe that crime, danger, and poverty make for good art. That's bullshit. But I also don't believe that the drop in crime means the city has to be more exclusively for those who have money. Increases in the quality of life should be for all, not just for a few. So since our first partnership with Foreign Policy, we've worked with a dozen publications, including this one is a piece we did with Al Jazeera America, and this is another one that we did with the photographer Sylvia Plaikey and The New Yorker. I'm going to take you very quickly through Trevor Paglen's project, which actually transformed the way we publish. We flew over the NSA, the National Reconnaissance Office, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency at night. This was not an easy feat, especially because the NGIA was in a flight restricted zone. But we flew over it, and we got these images, and what Trevor did, which was really incredible, is he made all of the images from the shoot available in the public domain. And we partnered with this piece with The Intercept, which is founded by Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, and Jeremy Scahill. And the piece basically was all of these images, which anybody can download and anybody can use, and it launched with The Intercept on the day that the site actually debuted. The piece was picked up and covered by all of these different publications, and it continues to be, for instance, it was on the cover of a Human Rights Watch report, Tom Englehart's book, you can see here, Shadow Government. You can find this image all over the place whenever talking about the NSA, and what was really important to Trevor is that there's just not many images of these intelligence agencies available. And how do we get them out there? How do we show people what these buildings look like, where all this money is going to? So, the final thing I just want to talk about is that this project really took a lot of time and energy to create. And as a result of that, our thinking, we decided to slow down. And we found ourselves, in essence, kind of lining up a little bit with the way that creative time works, right? And that meant ensuring that our artists are grounded in the communities that they cover to avoid the ubiquitous art world and media world in general pitfall of parachuting in to report on a crisis and leaving before any substantive work has been done. And the slower pace actually, it essentially allows us to work with more integrity, to fact check all the more rigorously, and to take time to massage the ideas that are still being formed. And simultaneously, it's allowed us to cultivate new paths for outreach. We have now a set of regional editors that are based everywhere from Istanbul to Nairobi to Vancouver. And these editors are seen as our eyes and ears on the ground, and they help us to deepen our sensitivity to local conditions. And I just will end it with, just this week, we co-published a piece with an incredible poet named Alec Vigman, who's part of the duo Dark Matter. And the piece talks about the current moment of unprecedented visibility for some transgender celebrities, but individuals who are gender non-conforming still face harassment, hostility, and fear. And the piece actually went viral, and this morning I checked, it was at 23,000 shares. It was what we did with The Guardian. And this is a lot more of the direction that we're sort of heading into, is really making sure that a lot of the pieces we create find a home in a partner publication. And just to say, to wrap it up, that, we strive to present artists engaging with pressing issues in an expanded range of forms, punctuating news feeds and homepages around the world with unexpected stories and images. And, we hope that our signature mix of art, activism, and journalism will become an increasingly visible and trusted source for unconventional forms of expression with real political impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, there's Amanda. Thank you all very much. Amanda and Brian and Marisa. It doesn't sound like you're slowing down at all, Marisa, but I love that idea. So we have, I didn't check my clock, but I'm sure we have some time for questions, 2:15. So would you mind being the other microphone person, Patty? So, yeah. Dave, could you bring up the lights a little bit? Thank you. Great. Yes. So many perspectives and probably so many questions. Who would like to start us out?
Well, this is very stimulating. It made me think of what Nitish said before his tongue was cut out. He said every artist should have his tongue cut out. But it's good he hadn't had it cut out before he made that utterance. I think it was Brian who was talking about Smithson and the writings of that period. You may have known the name Peter Hutchinson. He told me he was writing articles for Artforum, Art in America, and places like that. And he went to a party in New York, and someone said, "Peter Hutchinson, oh, you're the writer." And so he stopped writing. But this is so interesting about the need for artists to become articulate these days. And I wrote a piece this year about expertise and the articulate artist, thinking the word expertise, as you probably know, is a Greek word, and it means when the mute image speaks out and becomes articulate. And so the urge to combine language with image it's ancient, really. They put the poems on coins in order to say something pithy. But with the internet, such great changes are happening with the hyperlinks and with the new mediums, WordPress and places like that, that I do think that, and that's what I learned from PRAXIS, was the ways to stimulate or suggest the various layerings in a print form. It's quite fascinating. So I just want to make those remarks. Thank you.
Actually physically enter the journal, yes. I've never thought of it in those terms. I thought you were talking about conceptually enter the argument. No, conceptually enter the, but no, you're right, and I think that reinforces the point that I was making about the entanglement of our identities as architects and as designers, and maybe, you know, I think all of us are getting at this question in different ways too, and this notion of pairing of text and image and of the desire to be articulate within the context of a design practice. And I think because we see the design of the artifact as analogous or similar to the way we approach design problems so in that way, you're right, it is a kind of entrance. We didn't use that specifically architectural term when we thought of it, but that's exactly what it is a kind of entrance to but also conceptually it was the notion of thinking of the cover as a kind of design exercise also, just so that it would inhabit the same ideas about the issue thematic that the architects were also challenging, that we were interested in architects looking at this issue, and here's how we were making our own kind of design approach to that issue too. But I will say that is also what makes the issue challenging, and which is maybe leading to our ultimate end here, is this question of cost, I think, is maybe part of this too. And one thing that struck me in your conversation was about creative time that was so fascinating, and this notion also that you're not, like this notion that you have to give away the recognition, and also the incredible resources it must take and funding to support these people that are finding these stories, and right, and then that how do you, I mean, that's an incredibly generous intellectual position, right, that you allow that material into a kind of public domain. I'm moving off the topic a little here that you brought up, but for me that's an interesting piece of all this too, is where do resources come from in this?
I mean, I can sort of respond to that just a little bit. I think that really falls under what creative time is. I think it's we are a public art organization, and we felt like we had to somehow translate that into this project. And yeah, it does hurt sometimes, because people will talk to you about pieces and they'll not have any idea that you were the one who created it and commissioned it and had the idea. But you know, but it feels good to speak to people that would never read or have anything to do with the art world or artists. And so I think that's at the heart of what we're doing.
It's interesting, a couple of weeks ago we had a visitor to our class named Orit Gat. She's a writer on art and publishing and the internet, and she said something like, I don't want to misparaphrase her, but that, you know, you might have lost faith in for-profit publishing long ago, if you ever had it, right? And even nonprofit publishing is sort of beholden to certain interests. And she was sort of speculating that it's institutional publishing. It's interesting that you said, no, I'm going to stay out of the institution. That institutions are the places that might have the freedom right now to experiment and to, you know, broaden the bounds. Yeah.
Well, just one more thing about that, which is, I think, yeah, sorry. I think one of the desires for all of these writers, and maybe for every writer, is to expand their audience, right? And so this book, or even PRAXIS, you're talking about a pretty small audience. I mean, even limited by print run and physical accessibility. But now through social media, and what social media has spawned, which is the kind of partnerships and demand for content that Creative Time Reports taps into, you're suddenly talking about exponentially larger audiences of just untold magnitude. And so, to me, that's kind of the dream, to connect these really smart people who are thinking outside the box or in unconventional ways, with a much larger audience through whatever means possible.
I had a question for Marisa along the notes of funding. does it ever become a commercial conflict for creative time reports with the publishers in terms of advertising? And do your partners ever try and cross-sell your commission with advertisers?
Oh, that's a really good question. They tend to keep us out of that discussion. So if that has happened, I wouldn't know. And where we sit is in the op-ed section too, and in most places, like for instance with the Guardian. So yeah, does that answer your question? I mean, in terms of we really have this relationship with the editors, which is, I wish it was a little bit more extensive, but the reality is that these guys are churning things out constantly, and I'm providing them with something that's usually really clean, checked, and if there are some issues that they have with it, I don't often know, whether they do or not.
Does that ever come up as an opportunity, though, like when you're sort of pitching a story to, like, for example, I'm sure some creative time projects are open to sponsorship. Could there be an opportunity for a creative time report that is launched as like a larger feature in The Guardian that is sort of cross-promoted with brands and advertising? Like, does that become an editorial problem or opportunity? Because that's sort of like a realistic proposition to be made in terms of funding this work,
Right.
outside of just creative time.
Well, I'll just talk a little bit about our funding structure that might be of interest. We get general grants, the organization Creative Time gets grants, and then we get specific grants for the project, for Creative Time reports. One of the things I didn't talk about in the speech was that we actually never, it's so rare that an artist will talk about a project that they've worked on or why they are. So for instance, like if there's an artist who's done a project on sexual harassment, when they write a piece for us, we never actually have them reference the project. It is already assumed that they are an expert and they are writing about their experience. And so projects often don't make it into the project, into the piece itself. And so we haven't had that opportunity really. It's been a big separation in terms of, and the projects of Creative Time, we haven't, when we've covered the projects that Creative Time has done, so for instance we did a series of 5 artists for the Kara Walker project, and also for our Black Radical Brooklyn project, we did not co-publish those with another publication, simply because it really is our own project, and we didn't see that doesn't fit in terms of the partnership model we've created. I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
I don't even write. My question is for Brian. Thank you so much for speaking. I was wondering if you could talk, since you are a curator in much of your life, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see sort of confluences and differences between your curatorial practice and your editing practice, particularly regarding exhibitions and anthologies.
Does this work? No, that's a good question. I think, similar kinds of changes have taken place in museums and the curatorial world that you could track along the same lines as what's happened to the breakdown of generic distinctions between writing and art making. And I've always favored a more theatrical and engaging form of exhibition making. But it doesn't always work. So I feel like exhibitions should be much more experimental than they are. But, it's like some rigid formats are very conservative and hard to change. Institutions are difficult to change. I'm always looking around at smaller institutions that have the wherewithal or the freedom to create experiments with the exhibition format. Similarly, I'm always looking at smaller publications that have the freedom to experiment with writing formats or publishing or editorial formats. At the same time, this ties back to what I was saying before. You're always thinking about what's the audience? How can you engage the audience, both physically and intellectually, but also in terms of drawing more people into the collection of ideas that you're exploring. And so those two things are often in some sort of balance. Like how experimental or radical can you be in your practice while still enlarging this circle of people who are going to be willing to come with you on that journey and explore the ideas. Does that answer your question?
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, so my question is to Marisa, and it's mostly on the politics behind selecting the writers and the topics, and the kind of public debates that actually make it into the Creative Time reports, and if that is at all compromised when you start launching the pieces into other media outlets.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really good question. I'll tell you a little bit about our editorial practice, our process and how we work. So I would never I would never compromise an artist's point of view or their piece if it meant that I co-publishing. So I would just have it on Creative Time reports. That's, like I said during the talk, what's most important is really the artist's voices and making sure that the artists feel really, really comfortable and not that we're editing or curtailing things that they'd like to say. So when I do publish a piece with an artist, a political piece, that what we do is we get the piece, we look at it, and we say, does this feel like it could fit into another publication? We don't really work the other way around. It's really like, what I do is I think, okay, there is an issue. I know that there's going to be an anniversary of something, of like a war. That's going to happen, and who is the artist that's most poised to talk about this? Who's the artist whose practice has focused on this issue for so many years? And then we reach out, we ask them if they're interested. It's not always text, sometimes it's images, it's films, it's poetry, and then based on what we get, we then work with the artist to see, okay, will this be something that you'd be interested in co-publishing? I mean, we always ask that question first and foremost, and I think that's how we make sure that the artist doesn't feel compromised in any way.
Okay. Can I just a follow-up? And are there any stories, for example, that you choose not to include in your publication? So like something that is completely controversial, a topic that's completely controversial, or like a source of, like a kind of taboo, especially politically.
No, I don't know. If you look at our site, we've done kind of almost everything. I'll tell you that while it's not taboo, we don't really want to hear, well, it's not that we don't want to hear. We don't ask about the art world. Like, we don't ask artists to write about what's happening in the art world. We don't ask anybody to write about shows. That's really what we kind of say no to. I mean, we've talked about artists and wages and how come artists are asked to work for free. These things are important to us, right? But like a seminal show and a review of it, or like what's happening at MoMA, not of interest. So I'd say that's really what we don't work with.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much, and thank you everyone for participating in our first panel today. So we're going to take about a 15-minute break and then reconvene here at 2:45 and on to listening to our artists and designer writers. Thank you.